On June 14, 1966, two men who represented completely different Americas walked into the same building and carried with them more than reputations. They carried symbols. One was Muhammad Ali, 24 years old, newly crowned heavyweight champion, sharp as lightning and twice as loud. The other was Dean Martin, 49, smooth as velvet, established royalty in Hollywood, the man who could lean against a microphone and make the whole country feel at ease. They were both scheduled to appear on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, filmed at NBC Studios in Burbank, California. Neither had known the other would be there. The green room felt smaller than it was. Ali arrived first, pacing lightly, shadowboxing with invisible opponents, his energy refusing to sit still. And he had already begun to feel the weight of the country pressing in on him. He was no longer just a boxer. He was a headline. He had changed his name. He had aligned himself with beliefs that made half of America furious. He was unapologetic about it. He believed in speaking loudly enough that no one could pretend not to hear him. Dean entered minutes later. Calm, measured, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had already survived 3 decades in an industry that devoured the unprepared. He poured coffee, sat down, and let the silence exist. He had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than any punchline. They acknowledged each other with polite nods, but politeness did not remove tension. Ali saw in Dean the embodiment of what he was rebelling against: old Hollywood, polished and safe. And Dean saw in Ali the force of a generation that refused to be contained, a young man whose words often traveled faster than caution. Ali broke the silence. "You ever watch my fights?" Dean took a slow sip of coffee. "I've seen a few." "You see greatness?" Dean's eyes lifted, not dismissive, not mocking, just studying. "I see talent," he said evenly. "Greatness takes time." Ali smiled, but it was the competitive smile of a man who did not like being measured. "I don't wait for time. I make time wait for me." The exchange was not hostile. It was probing. Two men testing the weight of each other's words. A production assistant stepped in. 5 minutes. The Tonight Show couch was more than furniture. It was a national stage. Whoever sat there was judged by millions. That night, estimates would later claim nearly 70 million viewers tuned in across the country, an America divided by war, by race, by generational change. Dean walked out first to warm applause. He wore his tuxedo like armor. His public persona, half amused, half detached, was effortless. He joked with Johnny Carson, deflected praise, made the audience laugh in the safe way they expected. For a moment, everything felt predictable. Then Carson introduced Ali. The applause was louder, but uneven. Some cheers, some hesitation. Ali entered like a storm, refusing to apologize for the wind. He danced toward the couch, grinning, shadowboxing toward the cameras. He sat between Carson and Dean, claiming space without asking. The early minutes were playful. Ali boasted. The audience reacted with a mix of delight and discomfort. Dean remained composed, watching rather than interrupting. It was Ali who eventually turned the focus. "You ever step in a ring, Dean?" he asked. Dean shook his head lightly. "I get hit enough by critics, that's plenty." Laughter rippled through the studio. Ali leaned forward. "But you don't know what real pressure is. In that ring, it's just you and another man. No script, no retakes." Dean's smile thinned, not offended, but thoughtful. "Pressure comes in different forms," he replied. "Sometimes it's not fists. Sometimes it's expectations." The tone shifted, not toward anger, but toward something more honest. Ali spoke about carrying the hopes of his community, about being scrutinized for every word. Dean listened, truly listened. "You talk a lot," Dean said finally, gently. And sometimes the world hears the volume before it hears the message." Ali's eyes narrowed slightly. Maybe the world needs the volume. Maybe, Dean conceded. But sometimes strength is quieter. For a brief moment, the studio held its breath. Two definitions of power sat inches apart, one explosive, one restrained. Carson, sensing the depth, allowed the conversation to continue. Allie spoke about being young and unwilling to wait for change. Dean spoke about longevity, about learning that influence required endurance. Neither dismissed the other, but neither surrendered ground. Then came a moment that would later be replayed for decades. Allie challenged Dean directly. "You think you understand struggle?" Dean did not flinch. "I understand survival." Silence. Dean leaned slightly toward him, but lowering his voice enough that the audience leaned in. "And survival means protecting yourself, financially, emotionally, professionally. Talent doesn't protect you, discipline does." Ali blinked. The comment landed differently than the playful jabs before. It wasn't a public insult. It was advice disguised as warning. "You think I'm not disciplined?" Ali asked quietly. "I think you're brilliant," Dean answered. "But brilliance without structure gets taken advantage of." The audience sensed it. This was no longer a performance. It was mentorship forming mid-conversation. Ali studied him. For the first time that night, he stopped performing. "You offering to teach me something?" he asked. Dean gave a small nod. "If you want to learn." It was not condescension. It was recognition. The applause that followed wasn't explosive. It was steady, respectful. For the remaining segment, the tone softened. They laughed again. They joked about age, about confidence. But underneath the humor was something new, acknowledgement. Two men from different worlds had looked past caricatures and seen each other as complicated human beings. Backstage afterward, there was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, there was a handshake that lasted longer than expected. "You're not what I thought," Ali admitted. "Neither are you," Dean replied. Outside, headlines would simplify the night. They would describe tension, sparks, clash. But what 70 million people had truly witnessed was something subtler and more powerful, the moment two strong personalities chose curiosity over ego. In 1966 America, that was rare. And it was only the beginning. The night after their appearance on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson did not end when the cameras stopped rolling. For most guests, television was a moment, 30 minutes of exposure followed by a return to separate lives. But for Dean Martin and Muhammad Ali, something had shifted in a way neither could ignore. What began as cautious tension in a studio had turned into a conversation neither man had expected to have, and that conversation lingered in their minds long after the applause faded. The country was restless in 1966. The Vietnam War was escalating, civil rights protests were reshaping public life, and generational divides were no longer whispers but daily headlines. Ali stood at the center of that storm, young and defiant, unwilling to soften his voice for comfort. Dean stood at the height of established fame, respected across Middle America, known for ease rather than agitation. Yet that night had revealed something neither persona fully captured. Both men understood the cost of being misunderstood. 3 days later, Ali called Dean. The call itself was unexpected. Ali was not accustomed to reaching out for guidance. He was accustomed to leading rooms, not seeking advice within them. Yet something in Dean's measured tone on that couch had unsettled him in a productive way. It was not criticism that lingered, but the suggestion that greatness required protection. Dean answered without ceremony. There was no manager intercepting, no publicist screening the call. "You serious about what you said?" Ali asked directly. Dean knew exactly which part he meant. "I don't waste words on television," Dean replied. "If I offer something, I mean it." That afternoon, they agreed to meet privately in Los Angeles, away from cameras and commentary. Their meeting did not take place in a flashy office or a hotel suite. Dean invited Ali to his home, a quiet space that reflected stability rather than spectacle. The conversation lasted hours. There were no raised voices, no audience to impress. Dean spoke about contracts and percentages, about how entertainment and sports industries often favored the experienced over the talented. He described his early years in show business when enthusiasm had nearly cost him everything because he trusted handshakes instead of paperwork. Ali listened more than he spoke, an uncommon posture for him, but one born from curiosity rather than submission. Dean explained that public confidence must be matched by private discipline, and he told Ali that systems rarely protect the young or the outspoken without deliberate safeguards. "You fight in the ring," Dean said calmly, "but there are fights outside the ring that don't have referees." Ali admitted something that surprised even himself. He confessed that he had focused so fiercely on legacy and message that he had not examined the infrastructure beneath his success. He had assumed loyalty where there should have been verification. Dean did not exploit that vulnerability. Instead, he treated it as a sign of maturity. "Asking questions doesn't make you weak," Dean told him. "It makes you aware." Over the next several weeks, Dean arranged introductions to financial advisors and legal professionals he trusted, not to control Ali's decisions, but to ensure Ali understood them. The gesture was not about money alone, and it was about autonomy. Dean believed that if Ali was going to challenge systems publicly, he needed stability privately. Meanwhile, public pressure around Ali intensified. His refusal to be drafted into the military was becoming more than speculation. The debate was polarizing families, friendships, entire communities. Dean knew that any visible association with Ali during such a volatile time could affect his own career. Sponsors preferred neutrality. Networks valued predictability. Yet Dean did not retreat. He did not stage grand public declarations either. Instead, he chose consistency. When reporters asked about Ali, Dean refused to reduce him to controversy. He described him as thoughtful, disciplined, and principled, emphasizing character over headlines. That subtle framing mattered. It did not shout support, but it humanized a figure many were eager to simplify. In private, their conversations deepened. Ali spoke about faith, about conviction, about the weight of representing something larger than himself. Dean spoke about longevity, about how sustaining influence required patience. They disagreed often, but the disagreements were grounded in respect rather than rivalry. Ali challenged Dean on complacency. Dean challenged Ali on impulse. Both found value in the friction. What had begun as generational contrast became complementary perspective. Ali's fire reminded Dean that safety could become stagnation. Dean's steadiness reminded Ali that passion without planning risked burnout. When April 1967 arrived and Ali formally refused induction into the armed forces, the consequences were immediate. His heavyweight title was stripped, and his boxing license suspended. Public opinion fractured further. The young champion who had electrified arenas now faced legal uncertainty and financial instability. Dean watched the news quietly, aware that the real test of friendship was not forged in television studios, but in moments of consequence. He called Ali that evening. There was no dramatic speech, no theatrical reassurance. "You standing firm?" Dean asked. "Yes," Ali answered. "Then stand firm," Dean replied. "But let's make sure you're protected while you do." During the years that followed, while Ali navigated appeals and uncertainty, Dean's support remained steady. He did not exploit the association for publicity. He did not parade their connection in interviews. Instead, he offered guidance when asked and resources when needed. That discretion strengthened their bond. Ali understood that Dean's involvement was not performative. It was principled. For a man often accused of being merely a charming entertainer, Dean demonstrated a quiet courage that did not rely on applause. Their friendship altered both men in subtle but profound ways. Ali's rhetoric matured. While his confidence remained undiminished, his awareness of structural realities sharpened. He became more deliberate about how he built alliances and protected his long-term interests. Dean, meanwhile, began to view his own platform differently. He did not abandon humor or persona, but he grew less interested in hiding behind it. Observers noted a shift, an authenticity beneath the wit that felt grounded rather than distant. Those who knew him best understood that his conversations with Ali had influenced that evolution. And by the time Ali's conviction was overturned years later, the narrative surrounding him had shifted from controversy to vindication. When he returned to boxing, he did so not merely as an athlete, but as a symbol of perseverance. Dean watched his comeback fight with a quiet pride that did not need to be announced. Their paths crossed occasionally in public thereafter, and when they did, the warmth between them was unmistakable. It was not exaggerated. It did not require explanation. It was simply evident. What 70 million viewers had witnessed on that June night was not an attack or a spectacle. It was the beginning of accountability wrapped in conversation. In a decade defined by confrontation, two men chose dialogue. In an era that rewarded performance, they risked sincerity. And in doing so, they demonstrated that respect is not passive admiration, but active responsibility. Their bond would endure beyond headlines, beyond victories and losses, because it had been built not on convenience but on conviction. When the headlines faded and the noise of controversy settled into a long, grinding uncertainty, the true measure of friendship began to reveal itself. The country had moved from shock to argument, from argument to fatigue. Yet for Muhammad Ali, the consequences of his refusal were not abstract debates. They were daily realities. His license to box had been suspended, his title stripped, and courtrooms replaced arenas as the stages on which his future would be decided. For a man whose life had revolved around motion, discipline, and public triumph, the stillness was suffocating. The roar of crowds had once defined his rhythm. Now the silence of waiting tested his endurance in a way no opponent ever had. During those years, Ali traveled across college campuses, speaking to students, answering hostile questions, and defending his beliefs in rooms where applause was far from guaranteed. He faced criticism that was relentless and often personal. Some accused him of abandoning his country. Others accused him of arrogance disguised as conviction. Each speech demanded emotional stamina. Each night ended not with victory but with uncertainty about what the next morning might bring. The financial strain tightened steadily as legal fees mounted. Promises once made by associates dissolved under pressure. The business side of boxing, which Dean had warned him about, and revealed itself as a structure more fragile than Ali had assumed. Opportunities vanished. Endorsements evaporated. The security that fame seemed to guarantee proved conditional. Through all of this, Dean Martin remained present in a way that was both understated and unwavering. Dean understood something about public adoration that Ali was now learning firsthand. Applause is loyal only to momentum. When momentum pauses, many supporters disappear. Dean did not disappear. He did not deliver dramatic speeches in Ali's defense on television, nor did he attach his own brand to Ali's struggle. Instead, he operated quietly, arranging meetings with trusted legal minds, ensuring Ali had competent representation, and occasionally reminding him that dignity was not measured by current headlines. Dean's support was not loud, but it was consistent. But inconsistency in a volatile season became a form of shelter. Their conversations during this period shifted in tone. The playful banter that had characterized their first encounter matured into reflection. Ali admitted to moments of doubt, not about his principles, but about his endurance. He spoke of the exhaustion that comes from defending oneself endlessly. Dean listened with the patience of someone who had survived decades of scrutiny. He told Ali that longevity required pacing. "You don't have to answer every critic," Dean advised. "Sometimes strength is choosing which battles deserve your voice." It was not an attempt to soften Ali's convictions, but to preserve his stamina. Dean had learned that the industry could exhaust even the most talented performers by demanding constant reaction. He did not want that fate for Ali, and at the same time, Ali influenced Dean in ways that were less visible but equally meaningful. Watching Ali accept professional exile rather than compromise his beliefs forced Dean to evaluate his own boundaries. For years, Dean had mastered the art of staying agreeable, of navigating Hollywood's shifting expectations without becoming entangled in its conflicts. Yet observing Ali's willingness to absorb consequences for conviction stirred something within him. Dean began to allow glimpses of his own values to surface in interviews, subtle but clear. He no longer dismissed serious topics with reflexive humor. While he never transformed into a political firebrand, he demonstrated a quiet refusal to trivialize issues that demanded thought. Those who paid attention recognized the evolution. As legal proceedings continued, the broader cultural landscape shifted. The late 1960s were marked by upheaval and protest. Public opinion regarding the war began to fracture more visibly. Students marched. Families argued at dinner tables. The concept of patriotism was being re-examined across generations. Within that shifting climate, Ali's stance, once widely condemned, began to be reconsidered by some. Yet reconsideration did not erase hardship. The years away from the ring cost him not only earnings but also prime athletic time. The physical peak of a boxer is measured in narrow windows, and each passing month represented opportunity lost. Dean understood that lost time could never be restored. What could be preserved, however, was perspective. During one particularly difficult winter, Ali confided that he feared being remembered not for his achievements, but for his controversy. Dean responded with a story from his own early career, recounting moments when critics predicted his decline, when transitions in partnership or style had threatened his relevance. "People think careers are straight lines," Dean said. "They're not. They bend, they pause. Sometimes they disappear for a while. What matters is who you are when the lights come back on." That metaphor lingered with Ali. It reframed his absence not as an ending, but as a chapter. When the Supreme Court eventually overturned Ali's conviction in 1971, the decision marked more than legal vindication. It symbolized endurance rewarded. Ali returned to boxing not as a reckless young champion, but as a seasoned figure shaped by trial. His comeback fights carried emotional weight that transcended sport. Crowds that once questioned him now cheered with renewed admiration. The narrative had shifted from defiance to resilience. Dean watched that transformation with a sense of fulfillment that did not require public acknowledgement. He did not claim credit. He did not recount his involvement to reporters. He simply recognized that the young man who had once sparred with him verbally on national television had grown into a symbol of perseverance. Their reunion after Ali's return to the ring was understated. There was no orchestrated publicity, no staged reenactment of their earlier debate. They met privately, embraced as friends, and spoke not of controversy, but of continuity. Ali thanked Dean not only for practical assistance, but for treating him as a whole person during a season when many reduced him to a headline. Dean dismissed the gratitude gently, insisting that loyalty should not be extraordinary. Yet he understood that in public life, loyalty often is. As the 1970s progressed, both men continued along their distinct paths. Ali engaged in historic bouts that would become part of sporting legend. Dean maintained his presence in entertainment, balancing television, music, and film with the calm assurance of experience. They did not become inseparable companions. Their schedules and worlds remained different, but the foundation established during crisis ensured that when they did connect, the conversations carried depth rather than performance. The years without applause had revealed something essential. And fame can initiate encounters, but character sustains them. What began as tension had matured into trust. What started as debate had evolved into mutual respect forged under pressure. In a decade defined by division, their friendship demonstrated that disagreement need not dissolve into distance. It can instead refine understanding, provided both parties are willing to listen as seriously as they speak. By the time the 1980s arrived, both Muhammad Ali and Dean Martin had lived several public lifetimes. They had known stadiums filled with roaring crowds and television studios bright with approval. They had known criticism sharp enough to wound and silence heavy enough to linger. Yet what defined their later years was not the volume of applause but the depth of reflection. And the friendship that had begun in a tense green room in 1966 had matured quietly, weathering distance, evolving careers, and the inevitable slowing that time imposes on even the most dynamic personalities. What remained constant was respect rooted in shared experience rather than shared profession. As Ali's boxing career gradually closed, his legend expanded beyond sport. He became a global figure associated not only with athletic brilliance, but with moral conviction and humanitarian outreach. The world saw his charisma, his poetic confidence, and his unmistakable presence. What fewer people saw were the quieter moments of vulnerability that accompanied physical decline as Parkinson's disease began to affect him. Speech slowed, movements softened. Yet the man who had once dazzled audiences with verbal lightning now expressed himself with patience and effort. For Dean, witnessing that transformation was profoundly humbling. He did not see fragility. He saw endurance in a new form. Strength, he realized, had many expressions. Dean's own life carried sorrow as well. The loss of his son in a tragic accident altered him in ways fame could not cushion. Grief reshaped his public composure, drawing him inward. During that painful season, Ali reached out not as a celebrity, but as a friend. He traveled quietly, sat with Dean's family, and offered presence rather than speeches. There were no cameras documenting that exchange, no headlines narrating it. Yet those who were present understood that the bond forged decades earlier had transcended professional courtesy. They had once advised and challenged each other under studio lights. Now they shared silent support in private rooms. Their later conversations reflected perspective earned through experience. They spoke less about controversy and more about legacy. Ali often expressed gratitude that his stand during the late 1960s had ultimately been understood differently by history than it had been in the moment. Dean, reflecting on his own career, acknowledged that authenticity had brought him more peace than applause ever had. He confessed that the decision to stand publicly beside Ali, even in measured tones, had reshaped his sense of responsibility. "There are moments," Dean once told him, "when silence feels easier than speech. But those moments decide who we are." Ali listened, nodding slowly, recognizing the truth of it. As public memory began to mythologize both men, scholars and commentators revisited their famous Tonight Show exchange. Clips circulated in documentaries and retrospectives. Analysts described it as a generational clash or a cultural turning point. Yet the most significant impact of that night was not theatrical confrontation. It was the example of two men choosing dialogue over dismissal. In an era when disagreement often escalated into division, they modeled curiosity. They did not erase differences. They navigated them. That nuance became part of their shared legacy. When Dean passed away in 1995, tributes poured in from across the entertainment world. Among the most poignant acknowledgments was Ali's written reflection, emphasizing that Dean had seen him as a person during a season when many reduced him to controversy. And Ali's words highlighted something rarely celebrated in celebrity culture: quiet loyalty. He described Dean not as a performer, but as a protector of integrity, someone who had used influence responsibly. The message resonated because it revealed a dimension of Dean that casual viewers might never have suspected. 2 decades later, when Ali himself passed in 2016, the world gathered to honor a life that had transcended sport. Stories of his athletic genius were abundant, but so were accounts of his courage and compassion. Among the recollections shared by friends and family were references to Dean's steadfast presence during the most uncertain years. It became clear that their friendship had not been a footnote but a foundation during pivotal moments. Dean's children attended the memorial, representing continuity between families whose histories had intertwined unexpectedly. In retrospect, the narrative of an attack on live television was less significant than what followed. The initial tension had been real, but it was not destructive. It was clarifying. 70 million viewers may have expected spectacle. What they witnessed was transformation. 2 public figures shaped by different eras and experiences discovered that influence carries obligation. They demonstrated that respect is not passive admiration, but active engagement. They showed that courage sometimes appears not in dramatic gestures, but in consistent support. The cultural landscape has continued to change since their time. Media cycles accelerate, public debates intensify. Yet the lesson from that 1966 encounter remains relevant. That dialogue requires listening as much as speaking. Strength includes humility. Fame, when guided by conscience, can extend beyond entertainment to meaningful connection. Dean and Ali embodied those truths not perfectly, but sincerely. Their story endures because it is not about rivalry. It is about growth. It is about recognizing humanity in someone initially perceived as an adversary. It is about the willingness to reassess assumptions and to invest in another person's stability without demanding recognition. In the end, their greatest victories were not televised knockouts or chart-topping performances. They were the private commitments kept when applause was absent. That is the legacy that outlives the spotlight.